This just in, you are looking at obviously a very disturbing live shot there. That is the World Trade Center, and we have unconfirmed reports this morning that a plane has crashed into one of the towers.
Evidence, Elliot, of people being taken out of the building. You say that emergency vehicles are there, understandably so, but
with knives or box cutters.
Holy fuck! Oh my God! Oh my God!
Tower 2 does not look like an accident of any kind at this point. Another plane has hit Tower 2, the Twin Towers. You hate to say the words, but what comes to mind right now, terrorist attack. That is what it looks like at this point.
I think we have a terrorist act of proportions that we cannot begin to imagine at this juncture.
There have been in Manhattan one plane colliding with one Twin Tower. 18 minutes later, oh my God. Oh my God. That was the second tower of the World Trade Center collapsing before our eyes.
The V sign for victory being displayed in East Jerusalem today among jubilant Palestinians that the United States had been subject to this attack. What are we to make of that, Jennifer? Are we to, Yasser Arafat may issue this condemnation. Look at this. We're seeing people applauding, clapping, smiling, happy to know that thousands of Americans have died in this sneak attack.
Apparently, Palestinians took to the street chanting, "God is great." People were throwing candy, distributing candy to passers-by.
This group and its leader, a person named Osama bin Laden, are linked to many other organizations in different countries. They are recruited from their own nations and neighborhoods and brought to camps in places like Afghanistan, where they are trained in the tactics of terror. They are sent back to their homes or sent to hide in countries around the world to plot evil and destruction. We condemn the Taliban regime. It is not only repressing its own people, it is threatening people everywhere by sponsoring and sheltering and supplying terrorists. Americans are asking, why do they hate us? They hate what they see right here in this chamber, a democratically elected government. We have seen their kind before. They are the heirs of all the murderous ideologies of the 20th century. By sacrificing human life to serve their radical visions, by abandoning every value except the will to power, they follow in the path of fascism, Nazism, and totalitarianism.
At the Pentagon, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld announces the shooting war against terrorism is on. The targets, the Taliban military, air defense systems, command and control bunkers, airfields and warplanes around Kabul, Jalalabad, and Kandahar. Also, terrorist training camps of Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda terrorist network. But in this first wave, not bin Laden himself. But in a message released late today, apparently videotaped before the attack, a defiant bin Laden issues an ominous warning of more terrorist attacks against American targets.
And for the United States, I want to tell the United States and its people, I swear by God, by Allah, He who has raised the sky, that the United States will not have peace.
U.S. sources tell NBC News this first...
Welcome back. Just before we get started with our main features tonight, we have a couple of announcements to make and just a few introductions. First thing, just so that you know who some of the Freedom Party people are in the room, particularly on the provincial executive, current and past, I just thought you might want to know who they are and who was involved with Freedom Party. So just to quickly point some of these folks out to you, we'll start right here with Lloyd Walker. If you want to just raise your hand or stand up, Lloyd's the leader of Freedom Party. The past leader of Freedom Party, just before Lloyd was leader, was Jack Plant, and he's sitting over there in the far corner. Our founding chairman is with us tonight, and that's Mary Lou Goodcher, and you'll be seeing just a few minutes more of her shortly. Freedom Party's Chief Financial Officer, and certainly my right-hand man around the office, is Paul Blair, and he's sitting right there at the table. And the tax credits are no good without his signature. Yay, Paul. Party Secretary Barry Malcolm is, I think, over at that table there. Party Vice President Bill Frampton, right here at the front table. Executive Member Gord Mood, back at the table there, Gord. Executive Member Robert Vaughn, and also two-time trustee on the Board of Education, and our webmaster, who's up here from Detroit right now, and that's Greg Jones. He takes care of our website. And we also have one of our original founding members here who's not on our executive anymore, but still has contributed and done a lot of our original literature and things that we wrote. And that's Murray Hopper, sitting right here. Murray was a socialist for 40 years, and then he discovered freedom. And then we, of course, have our volunteer for the evening and for a lot of things around the office, Carol Vandenberg at the back there. Now, just as we get started, just with the announcements, I'm going to have Bill here. We have a petition that we just want to pass around, and it'll just be on a clipboard. And I know some of you have already signed this petition. What it is a petition regarding the Ontario Bill 30, formerly known as Bill 155. And this is related to the issue tonight. But what this particular bill does, and we're opposed to it, is that it pretty well gives the police carte blanche to do what they want with people's property. And all the details of the bill's faults are right at the top of it, but just to bring your attention to the one or two really outrageous things that are in this bill, and this is verbatim. Under Bill 30, property can be confiscated from any citizen of Ontario. You don't have to do anything. You can even have an act or omission. You might not have done something and they can take your property. But this is the interesting part, is that an offense constituting unlawful activity may be found to have committed even if A, no person has been charged with the offense, or B, a person was charged with the offense, but the charge was withdrawn or stayed, or the person was acquitted of the charge. They still get to keep your property. And they no longer are going to be operating on the basis of beyond a reasonable doubt. It's now going to be a matter of probability. So now this was already coming down the pipe before what happened on September 11th, so this is the kind of thing that you'll be reading more about in our future newsletters. But that'll be the thing we'll be passing around right now. I know some of you have already signed it, don't feel obligated, but we'd like to collect as many signatures as we can, and we'll be presenting them to the PC government at some time in the future. The next point of attention I wanted to bring to your attention is basically our website, freedomparty.org, which is a happening place right now. We launched this site in 1996. It is now just a few years later, and we're already getting steady traffic on the site of about 2 million hits a year. That's several thousand hits a day, by the way. Thanks to Bill Frampton here, we've now got a huge bookstore online where we're linked to Amazon.com and Laissez-Faire Books and other areas with the whole Freedom bookstore just waiting to be discovered. And we also have now the radio shows. Some of the things that you have on those tapes that we just passed out are also available on our website, where you can just download them as MP3 files. We in fact have 10 shows online right now that probably adds up to almost 24 hours worth of entertainment. And these are live talk shows, radio shows, us in action on the front lines. These are not one-sided diatribe kind of things. You will hear us in debate. One of the shows online is already our first reaction publicly to what happened on September 11th, and it's available there. And in keeping with the Christmas season coming up, we're going to be posting one in a couple of weeks, a show I did a few years ago where the subject is, we don't always have to be real heavy here, but the subject is Santa a socialist? And so you might want to tune in for that. That'll be online in a couple of weeks. But there's a lot of, everything I'm actually announcing now, you can find out more about on our website. Next item. I know a lot of you are asking about the plight of Mr. Elijah Elliott, who's sitting at the table right there and was a victim of the Ontario's Human Rights Commission. I defended him in front of that commission. We won that case. It's gone. I mean, there's a whole history behind this thing. Suffice it to say that right now he's in his counter lawsuit. He's now suing Susan Eagle and the bank that took the buildings from him. This whole story, again, is on our website. But he is always looking for funds and for support, particularly now, since his case is tentatively going to court sometime in January, February of the coming year. And now's the final crunch. He's already spent about $50,000 on this case, and we're going to need another 20, but that's going to be it. We'll know one way or the other. So we just wanted to bring that to your attention, and there's also a lot of details on that whole issue online. Next point. Yes, it's true, if you've heard the rumors, there is a Freedom Party of Canada now in formation, and a website has already been set up. Unfortunately, our one executive member who's doing this couldn't be with us tonight. It's lawyer Paul McKeever, who is working on a pretty heavy case this weekend in Toronto and couldn't be with us, but he's leading the charge on setting up this party. And if you want to find out more about it, you can find out on our website or on freedomparty.ca, which we also have now too. And that's another development coming up. And for the last quick one, I'm going to introduce you to one person I already mentioned already, our founding chair, Mary Lou Kutcher, who will be talking to you about an event coming up on December 2nd and across many cities in North America, and we're going to be participating here. And it is the Walk for Capitalism. And that's going to be Sunday, December 2nd, correct? And Mary Lou, come on up and just give us 1 or 2 minutes appraisal here.
I'm a freelance ambassador for Liberty, and the current project that I think is very, very exciting is this Walk for Capitalism. An individual with an institute called the Emeritus Institute in Melbourne, Australia, had been doing things locally in Australia, and this summer decided to try having an international Walk for Capitalism and establishing the first annual Capitalism Day to be celebrated every year around the world. And a few people thought it was a great idea, and there now are 108 cities with coordinators who have registered to have a walk. And Toronto, of course, being the largest city in Canada, ours will probably be one of the biggest, but there are 22 cities in Canada, I think, and 50 in the United States, and then there are a bunch of them scattered around the rest of the world. 30 countries altogether involved. So just to give you some quick details, if it's possible for you to go and walk. It's on December the 2nd, Sunday. In Toronto, we're getting together at the Metro Hall Square, which is right next to Roy Thompson Hall. And rally starts at 10, walk at 11, and it's going to be great. And we're giving out a capitalism award. And Bill will tell you what time and what place to meet here in London. And the one that was to be held in Sarnia, I think what we're going to do is persuade them to hop on a bus and come down to Toronto and walk with us and just make it an even bigger affair. But go online, walkforcapitalism.org, or give me a call, or ask me before you leave for a flyer, and it's got all the information on there that you may need. Let's walk.
And just to fill you in, for people in the London area, we'll be meeting at 1 p.m. next Sunday, December the 2nd, at this parking lot at York and Wellington Streets, right across the street from the Convention Centre in London. And we'll be departing for our walk from that location. So I encourage every one of you who is able to join us, including the people from Sarnia, because after all, London's closer than Toronto. The more the merrier. Let's make this a successful event. As Mary Lou mentioned, it's happening in 108 cities around the world, and it's only going to get bigger and better from year to year. So let's walk.
Okay. One last detail. Carol, you want to come up? It's time for the raffle. Okay. First we're going to go, I guess, third prize, second prize, and then first prize. Is that how it works?
Yep.
Okay. So I'm going to hold that high, shake it a bit. Can you reach?
Yeah.
Okay.
236.
Ooh.
Who got it?
Who's got 236?
You laugh. Pick another word.
Nobody here.
Gotta be here to win, right?
Somebody's got to have it.
Somebody's got to have it. It would be...
I got it.
You got it. There you go. Let's see it.
It's kind of logical, you know.
Listen, Paul tried to sell me 5 for $10 instead of 6. And Carol came along later and said you got ripped off. This is the one that she gave me because it's got the number written on it. None of the others have. Thanks very much.
Okay, let's go for next.
$193. It's the last 3 digits on the, if you've got the ticket, it's 0745 193. It's not. No! Draw another one, okay. Maybe Gordon should try.
I don't think it'll make a difference. What's the maker? It's not his.
Yeah, okay, it's Peter's. 246.
No, that's not me.
Oh.
Over there? Oh, very good.
Excellent.
And now for the big anti-terrorism, anti-censorship poster here.
Extra large.
291.
Oh, that's me. If I can read that one. 291.
There you go. Okay. That's it for Freedom Party. Now we're going to turn our attention to our subject for the night and to our guest speakers. I imagine every one of us in this room knows exactly where they were when they first heard about what happened on September 11th, and I'm certainly not going to go into a big long diatribe about repeating that whole experience. Emotionally, I got to tell you, a couple of weeks after that, there were some interesting dynamics going on around us. Not just in society in general, even in my close circle of friends. But that being what it may, we felt immediately that this required some kind of a response. This dinner is in fact one of our first stages in our response. Our Walk for Capitalism, participating in that is another stage of a response. And we're going to be doing a lot of talking and public speaking about this issue. We are very fortunate tonight and to have 2 extremely distinguished guests. And they each agreed to come here to speak because they're interested in this issue. This is something that they know affects everyone. I'm not going to go into the complete biography of these folks. We've left an extra pamphlet on everyone's table if you want to reread that. I know most of you have already gotten that. So I'll start with our first speaker of the evening, and that's Professor Ken Hilborn. Now, Professor Hilborn is Professor Emeritus of History at UWO. He's a specialist in 20th century relations with a particular emphasis on the impact of ideologies. Now, Professor Hilborn has been a Freedom Party member since almost as long as I can remember. It must be since at least the later mid-'80s. Isn't that right, Ken? Or maybe longer. Probably around that. And has certainly been politically active in on several fronts and by supporting other groups with similar ideologies to what perhaps Freedom Party is. He's been published in Consent magazine, our sister newsletter publication, and on more than one occasion, and will no doubt be so again in the future. He is certainly an ardent opponent of political correctness, and he's acutely aware of the dangers posed by nations who are motivated by hostile ideologies. When I asked him to speak here tonight, and he was very quick to pick up on the message that he wanted to deliver. And so, without saying much more about that, Ken, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Bob. Ladies and gentlemen, less than 3 months ago, that is in late August or early September, probably nobody in this room foresaw that before mid-October, the United States would be at war with the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. Such failures of prediction are not exceptional. Indeed, they are perfectly normal. Wars or events that quickly lead to wars often take us by surprise. Now imagine yourself back in 1977, being asked to identify the wars, those involving at least one major power, that were likely to be fought over the ensuing quarter century, meaning the period from 1977 to 2002. It's unlikely that you would have come up with an even partially accurate list. I was an academic specialist in international relations, and I know that I would not have come up with an accurate list of those wars. Britain against Argentina, the Soviet Union against a US-backed anti-communist resistance in Afghanistan, the United States against a pro-Soviet regime in Grenada, a regime that did not even come to power until March of 1979. The United States against a drug-smuggling dictator in Panama. United States and allies against Iraq. United States and allies against the Serb remnant of what was still in 1977 a united Yugoslavia. And most recently, of course, the United States with allies against the Taliban and associated Islamic extremists. I don't think I would have selected any of those wars as likely for the next quarter century had I been drawing up that list in 1977. The point I am making is that if the past is any guide, we in the democracies are very unlikely to foresee, long in advance, most of the wars that lie ahead. They will take us by surprise, and they will probably have to be fought largely with weapons already in the arsenal before the military operations begin. Moreover, complex weapons systems take many years to move from the stage of development and testing to full operational status. If a country waits to decide on a new weapon until a particular war is imminent, or even until it is readily predictable, that country may well find that it has delayed too long. It may well be acting too late. Delay in developing anti-missile defense is especially dangerous because the absence of such a defense offers an incentive, indeed virtually an invitation, for proliferation of nuclear missiles to additional countries. Most of the countries of the world live quite comfortably with the knowledge that the United States could bomb them at any time, or even wipe them off the map, and that they could do nothing effective about it. They live comfortably with that knowledge, as Canada does, because they have no intention of doing anything that would cause the Americans to go to war against them. But if a regime wants a free hand to invade its neighbors, or to engage in some other provocative misbehavior, then it needs some means of deterring the United States from intervening. The ability to destroy even a handful of American cities would clearly serve that purpose. Now, if the Americans had strong anti-missile defenses in place, defenses capable of protecting not only North America, but also allied countries overseas, if the Americans had those defenses, it would be pointless for any relatively minor power, such as Iraq or North Korea, to spend its resources on acquiring a long-range missile capability. That capability would have no deterrent value because whatever missiles might be launched would be unable to reach their targets. They would be, in one way or another, shot down or destroyed in some fashion. But as long as the United States and its allies remain defenseless against missiles, any regime that wants a free hand to misbehave must be strongly motivated to deploy at least a small force of that kind. Now, bad as it was, what happened in New York on September the 11th was almost trivial, compared to what would have happened if a nuclear warhead had exploded over the city. From our local standpoint, of course, it would have been even worse if a nuclear warhead exploded over Detroit, especially if we were downwind at the time. It's commonly said that nobody would dare launch a nuclear missile against the United States because the Americans would retaliate by destroying the country that did so. But there were several reasons for regarding the threat of retaliation as an unreliable, thoroughly unsatisfactory means of averting a potential disaster. For one thing, consider the problem of prevailing winds. There may be innocent countries, even friendly countries, downwind from the aggressor, and those countries would suffer from the radioactive fallout that an American retaliatory strike would unleash. A second problem is that any attack on the United States would have been launched by a dictatorship or some kind of authoritarian regime, if not totalitarian. Even if the effects of retaliation could be limited to a single country, killing millions of innocent people in order to hit back at a few guilty individuals, the dictator and his henchmen, could be reasonably interpreted as an act of genocide, a crime against humanity. If an Islamic country were devastated, or if it were downwind and took casualties from fallout, the effect might well be to radicalize previously moderate Muslims against the West, increasing the popularity of fundamentalist extremist factions. The result could be the fall of moderate governments, in countries like Pakistan, for instance. It could be the fall of moderate governments and their replacement by fanatical ones of the sort that came to power during the 1990s in Afghanistan, the Taliban regime that gave sanctuary to Osama bin Laden and his terrorist training camps. A third problem arising from the first and second is that those who launched a missile against the United States would actually want retaliation. Suppose that an aggressive regime in some Islamic country has acquired long-range missiles for a strictly rational, limited purpose, namely to deter the West from responding to aggression by doing what was done to Iraq in 1991. But suppose further that Muslim extremists have infiltrated that regime's armed forces, and that they succeed in overthrowing the government, or perhaps just in gaining control of a missile base. They might launch the weapons against such targets as New York and Chicago and Washington, precisely in the hope of American retaliation. Retaliation, they believe, will turn the entire Islamic world against the Western infidel. A fourth problem with retaliation, and arguably the biggest one, arises from the development of mobile launchers for intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. Russia already has this technology, the form of the SS-25, SS-27 Topol-M missile, and so does China have that technology. Once achieved by one or two nations, technology tends to spread to other countries as well. The mobility of missile launchers facilitates concealment. It allows you to conceal missiles inside barns, in road or railway tunnels, under highway overpasses, and so on. As long as missiles are in fixed and known locations, deterrence is more likely to succeed because the attacker faces two unsatisfactory choices. Either to launch all his missiles in the first strike, leaving himself with nothing further in reserve, either to launch all his missiles in the first strike or to retain part of his force and face the prospect of its being destroyed on the ground when the victim strikes back. In either case, the attacker must know that there is really nothing to restrain his victim's retaliation. Nothing except a possible reluctance to commit genocide, a possible concern about the effect of fallout on countries downwind, and in certain cases, a fear of international political repercussions. By contrast, if ICBMs are on mobile launchers that can be reliably concealed, it becomes more tempting to launch only one or two missiles at a time. After destroying a single American city, to show that he was in earnest, an attacker could announce demands. warning that either retaliation or a failure to comply with the demands would mean the loss of more cities. With no anti-missile defense and no means of finding and taking out the enemy missiles before launch, that's the critical point, no anti-missile defense and no means of taking out the enemy missiles before launch, the United States would find itself in an extremely awkward predicament. Unless the survival of the United States as an independent country were at stake, as it used to be in relation to the Soviet threat, unless that were the case, one wonders whether any US president would be willing to retaliate against any enemy target if he knew that doing so would mean death for additional hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, of Americans. Now, during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and the United States based part of their missile forces in submarines, they achieved both mobility and a considerable degree of concealability. These weapons were hidden under the seas, but each side also had attack submarines that did all they could to shadow the adversary's missile submarines. And the attack submarines tried to do so without revealing their own presence, without revealing their own movements. So a missile submarine commander could not be entirely sure that he was not being tracked by an attack submarine. So a missile submarine that set about firing its missiles would have to run the risk of being immediately torpedoed by an attack submarine. So that was a problem for the missile submarines, because land-based mobile missiles do not face that danger. They pose a more difficult problem than submarine-based ones. In the Persian Gulf War of 1991, the American and Allied forces enjoyed complete air supremacy. Their planes were ranging far and wide over Iraq, and yet Iraq was able to keep on launching its Scud missiles against both Israel and Allied bases in Saudi Arabia. Our planes could not find those Scud missile launchers to destroy them before the missiles were launched. At least quite a few of those missile launchers escaped detection after they had launched missiles. Iraq kept on launching those missiles against both the Israelis and Saudi Arabia. If Iraq had possessed the capability to do the same thing with nuclear ICBMs against targets in the United States, the Iraqi seizure of Kuwait would probably have gone unchallenged. Now, as I mentioned, land-based mobile ICBMs have already been acquired by the Russians and more ominously by the Chinese communists. In August of 1999, China flight tested a mobile missile known as the DF-31, supposed to be able to reach the western United States. Apparently, this is a missile that can be moved by truck. Now, the Chinese have also been working on a longer-range mobile missile called the DF-41, intended to be moved by truck and capable of hitting any part of the United States. The Chinese development of such weapons raises the danger that at some point China might use them as a means of putting pressure on the Americans over Taiwan. That is, to deter Washington from intervening against an invasion of that island or against a naval blockade or whatever means Beijing might choose to bring Taiwan under its control. In 1995, a highly placed Chinese general was quoted as saying that Americans cared more for Los Angeles than they did for Taipei, that being the capital of Taiwan. Moreover, in February of last year, a writer in the official Chinese Army newspaper warned the United States that it would be risking what he called serious damage to its national security if it intervened in a clash between Taiwan and Beijing. The writer pointed out that unlike Iraq and unlike Yugoslavia, China could launch a long-distance strike with its ICBMs. Now, for diplomatic reasons, of course, President Bush and his administration are unwilling to justify their plans for anti-missile defense by referring to a potential Chinese threat. China is not being portrayed in that light by the administration. The administration prefers to speak of rogue states, such as Iraq. But it is hard to believe that American strategists have entirely shut their eyes to the ugly possibility that China may become a rogue state at some time in the future. Now let me turn now to a few of the arguments often used against the development and deployment of anti-missile defenses. One of them is scarcely an argument at all, in any proper sense. It is mere rhetoric. The whole concept of anti-missile defense, we are told, is mere science fiction, something that cannot work in real life. Those who make this objection overlook the reality that science fiction has often become science fact. Among the most significant weapons of 20th century warfare was the tank, which first made its appearance on the battlefield in 1916 during the First World War. Before that, however, the tank had been imagined in fiction, in science fiction, by the writer H.G. Wells in a short story published in 1903. Indeed, much of what we know was relatively recent history would have been looked upon as the wildest kind of fiction when the 20th century began. When it began, the first successful test of the Wright brothers' flimsy little flying machine still lay in the future. That did not happen until December of 1903. Suppose that you were living exactly 100 years ago, and somebody presented you with a book that we would recognize today as an accurate account of certain momentous events that lay ahead. From the perspective of 1901, you would probably read that account with almost total disbelief. It would be the wildest of science fiction. The story of air combat in the Battle of Britain would be astonishing enough, but even more so would be the Battle of Midway, a great clash of naval power in which the opposing fleets never exchanged gunfire, but fought by launching torpedo planes and dive bombers against each other from odd-looking ships with flat tops, the kind of ship that had never been seen, of course, in 1901 or before. Your incredulity, your sense of disbelief would grow as you went on to read about the great bomber fleets that struck at Germany and Japan, the destruction of the city of Hiroshima by a single bomb, the development of long-range intercontinental military rockets, and the American landings on the moon. Are you kidding me? Landing on the moon? Science fiction, sure. And yet it was done by 1969. It is a safe bet that a great deal of what will happen in the century lying ahead of us would be equally astonishing to most people now living. Suppose that somehow you were transported forward in time to the year 2101, and that you find yourself reading a book on the history of the 21st century. Perhaps you might learn about a great battle in, let's say, the year 2083. Perhaps it is called the Battle of the Martian Moons, an encounter in which the energy beam weapons of the United States interplanetary fleet shattered the combined space forces of Russia and China, thus securing for the Americans the undisputed mastery of the solar system. Today, in 2001, a story of that sort would strike most readers as sheer fantasy. But it is not a bit more fantastic, than many of the actual events of the last 100 years would have seemed to most people in 1901. The mere fact that a proposed weapon may seem like a science fiction fantasy is no argument against it. Those who dismiss anti-missile defense as science fiction appear to believe in what may be called the myth of the ultimate weapon. The myth of the ultimate weapon. That is, the assumption that intercontinental ballistic missiles are inherently unstoppable, that in one way or another a missile will always get through. Perhaps it is said a defense against missiles will simply lead potential attackers to build more missiles. That's one of the arguments. A defense against missiles will simply lead potential attackers to build more missiles to overwhelm the defending forces. Alternatively, the attacker will use countermeasures to neutralize a defense. In either case, so we are told, the result will be the same. The attack succeeds, the defense fails. Now, these views are based on the assumption that in the race between offensive and defensive weapons, the potential attacker will have the resources to compete successfully against the economic and technological resources of the United States. Now, personally, once a defensive system has been developed and deployed, I bet on the United States being able to expand and improve that system more rapidly than any adversary could expand or improve his striking force. It's true that an extremely limited defensive system, this is a big point, an extremely limited defensive system might encourage lesser powers to build additional ICBMs in an attempt to overcome it. But a robust defensive system, a strong defensive system, would simply make it hopeless for lesser powers to compete in that way. And as for countermeasures, such as decoy fake warheads, the side with technological superiority, meaning the Americans, should have a pretty good chance of coming up with effective countermeasures to the countermeasures. In reality, far from being the unstoppable ultimate weapon, ballistic missile warheads are inherently vulnerable. Often overlooked, that point. Ballistic missile warheads are inherently vulnerable. They may seem to move very fast in relation to the speeds that we are accustomed to in our daily lives, but in relation to the speeds attainable in space, warheads following a ballistic trajectory towards surface targets are very slow, no more than a few miles per second. They have to be relatively slow, because additional speed would cause them to overshoot their targets or escape from the gravity of Earth altogether. Interceptor missiles would not be subject to any similar limitation, because they would not be coming back to Earth's targets, to surface targets. Interceptor missiles would be much faster, especially if they were launched from battle satellites already in space. And laser weapons would operate at 186,000 miles per second, about 300,000 kilometers per second, that being the velocity of light. Arguments against anti-missile defense often amount to arguments against just about any new weapon. In the late 1930s, for example, it might have been said that Britain should not build fighter interceptors, the Hurricanes and Spitfires, because doing so would merely force the Germans to build more bombers, or it would lead the Germans to deploy countermeasures, such as additional fighter escorts for their bombers. Or it might have been said that there was no point in building anti-submarine warships, because the enemy would merely deploy more submarines, and so on. Of course, one has to expect competition in weaponry. That is not a good argument against having weapons. It is an argument for winning the competition. And the best way to win is to get a head start on one's rivals or potential rivals by taking the initiative in exploiting to the full every technological possibility. The long stalemate in World War I, with tragically heavy casualties, arose from the fact that neither side held a decisive technological advantage. Holding such a decisive technological advantage, along with skill in using it, is the key to winning quick victories with a minimum of loss. That has been true ever since warfare was in its infancy. When David fought Goliath, David won easily and quickly. He won easily and quickly because he was using a superior weapon, one that could kill or incapacitate from a safe distance. At the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, a small English force, numbering fewer than 6,000 men, faced a great French army of at least 25,000. The result was a thoroughly one-sided slaughter. The small English force was victorious, losing perhaps 100 men. The French lost many, many thousands. Like David, the English had a superior weapon that could kill from a safe distance, in this case the famous longbow. But because they had been so successful with the longbow, the English became complacent. They failed to take advantage of new technological possibilities. The tide of war later turned in favor of France, partly because the French adopted a newfangled weapon known as artillery. Well, that kind of thing has happened repeatedly in history. It is a warning against ever being content with the weapons you already have. However well they may have served you in the past, however well they may serve you in the present, you must think of whether they will serve you equally well in the future. One should always press ahead to explore new frontiers of technology and to exploit their potentialities to the full. Otherwise, some ambitious adversary may seize the opportunity to creep up on you from behind and take you unawares, take you by surprise with very unpleasant results. Now, some critics complain that anti-missile weapons are especially undesirable because they would involve what the critics call the militarization of space. Actually, it's rather too late to object to such militarization, because the space near our planet already has a wide assortment of orbiting satellites that serve military purposes. Purposes that include weather forecasting for the military, communications, surveillance, navigation, pinpointing the location of both friendly forces and those of the enemy, and providing guidance for weapons like cruise missiles. Moreover, and most important in the present context, lack of anti-missile defense means that space provides an open highway for ballistic missile warheads to proceed to their targets, possibly including our cities, the cities of the Western world. It is hard to see why space can properly be militarized in these ways, but not in ways that would protect a nation's civilian population. Now, in the 19th century, command of the sea was central to global strategy. In the 20th century, it became apparent that to maintain command of the sea required also command of the air. In the 21st century, command of both sea and air requires command of space. That is, the ability to use space for one's own military purposes while preventing the enemy from using it in any way that would seriously limit one's own freedom of action. And a threat to your cities from concealed ballistic missiles obviously does impose a limit on your freedom of action. Critics of defense against missiles often claim that it would be pointless because the bad guys who cannot deliver missiles to Western cities, to American cities, will simply resort to terrorism instead. Once again, this kind of argument is really one against self-defense of any kind. It might equally well be said that a bank should not take precautions against embezzlement because doing so will force criminals to resort to armed robbery. Or that police officers should not wear bullet-resistant vests because criminals will respond by aiming at the head. Obviously, it is indispensable to take precautions against terrorism. We know that all too well. Necessary to take precautions against terrorism, but those precautions will be of no use if the bad guys can lob in a missile warhead instead. Another argument holds that a defense against intercontinental ballistic missiles would be illegal, because it would mean violating the sacred ABM Treaty signed by the United States and the Soviet Union in 1972, a treaty that did in fact prohibit most defenses of the kind in question. Now, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, this treaty is regarded as having remained in effect. Some legal experts disagree about the propriety of this, but the treaty is generally regarded as having remained in effect as between the United States and Russia. Under the treaty terms, however, either party has a right to withdraw from the arrangement, a legal right to withdraw from the arrangement 6 months after giving notice of an intention to do so. In view of the American right to withdraw from the treaty legally, there's never been any genuine possibility that the Americans would violate the treaty. There's never been any conceivable need for the Americans to violate the treaty. They could simply withdraw from it. Another argument is that quite apart from legalities, the ABM Treaty is such a valuable agreement that it must be preserved in the interests of global arms control. The reality is rather different for the reasons I explained earlier. The lack of an anti-missile defense promotes proliferation of nuclear missiles because it makes those missiles worth having. Now, because the Russians want to be able to think of themselves as the nuclear equal of the United States, this is a matter of national pride, not strategic need, because the Americans have no reason to attack and disarm Russia. Because the Russians want to be able to think of themselves as the nuclear equal of the United States, Russia has been reluctant to accept any change in the ABM Treaty that would allow the Americans to develop anti-missile defenses. Now, as I explained, of course, Washington is legally free to withdraw from the ABM agreement. And by making clear his willingness to make use of that option, President Bush gained leverage with Russia. as long as Bush seemed inclined in the fairly short term to pull out of the ABM treaty, Bush had leverage with Russia, confronting Moscow with the alternative of agreeing to modification of the treaty or ending up with no treaty at all. The risk now, since September the 11th, is that because of the priority given to maintaining the anti-terrorist coalition, President Bush will keep Russia happy, keep President Putin happy, by postponing American withdrawal from the treaty more or less indefinitely, so that pressure on Russia will be relaxed and that Moscow, particularly the more nationalistic elements in Moscow, will no longer see any need to accept a revised arrangement for control of anti-missile weapons. Now, if the present terms of the treaty remain in effect, unmodified, no revised arrangement, if that happens, the result would be to cripple the development of anti-missile defenses and leave the United States facing an increasingly dangerous situation. A situation that would obviously entail dangers for Canada as well, since, for example, Detroit and Windsor could not readily be separated by someone targeting a nuclear weapon. The effects would certainly spill over into Canadian territory, quite apart from fallout coming in our direction in London. So the situation would entail major dangers for Canadians as well as Americans. It's therefore unfortunate that the present government in Ottawa has been either hostile to missile defense or at least unwilling to endorse it. I believe that instead of talking about the supposed virtues of this ABM treaty, Ottawa should encourage Washington to emphasize strategic realities. But unfortunately, I think we are unlikely to get such a change in policy until we get a change in government, which perhaps is one of the reasons why we should welcome the arrival of a Freedom Party of Canada.
Did you like that segue or what? I like that. Now we're going to hold our questions till the end of our second. John, the floor is yours. Tell us what you have to say about this whole situation. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the floor, but I think I'll just take the podium for the moment. Actually, I've known Bob and Lloyd, I guess for about 7 years or so through the Montgomery Tavern Society, and I must say that I have a very, very strong respect for both of them and for the Freedom Party, and for me actually it was a considerable honor to be invited to address you, and I thank you for that honor very much. That having been said, talking about terrorism actually, the problem with terrorism is that in a liberal democratic society it actually means that you have a need for security, and you actually do have to tighten up on some things, and these are responses that the Freedom Party must automatically be opposed to in some respects. And so actually I think some of the things we're going to be talking about tonight, some of the things we have to think about coming months are going to be difficult to handle. But anyway, never mind January 1st, 2000 or January 1st, 2001. The new century began on September 11th. And even though no Canadians, so far as we know, have yet fired a shot in this war, although there are a handful of our people inside Afghanistan, the Canadian military is now involved in its first war of the 21st century. What's more, of course, is we know that 25 Canadians were killed in the World Trade Center bombing, and like everybody else, our economy sustained a lot of very serious damage as a result of the attack and its aftermath. In the 20th century, Canada went to war on a number of occasions for a lot less provocation than this. We began the last century by being involved in the Boer War, which of course is something that anybody writing a century ago could have easily seen. Then we got into the First World War, where the Canadian Corps of 4 divisions provided I think one of the elite formations in the British forces. Of course, if you look at the last year of the war, you had the period Canada's 100 Days, where the 4 Canadian divisions met and shattered 24 German divisions, as our army proved to be one of the most modern, innovative, and technically proficient armies of the world at that time. and set the examples for things. You come along with the Second World War, where our very small country of 11 million people produced an army of 5 divisions and 2 armored brigades, plus all the add-on troops, a navy that became one of the world's leaders in anti-submarine warfare, because that's actually where our navy really came to birth, hunting submarines, and that's one thing our navy still does very well. Canadian airmen were everywhere, and of course our army literally met the very best troops Hitler had to offer, toe to toe, took them on, and sent them packing. You know, Canadian infantrymen in battle for the first time met the most hardened and best equipped troops Hitler had and defeated them. We had a very impressive military. Unfortunately, we've coasted for a long time on our successes in 1944 and 45. We were involved in the Korean War, a very minor, but again an important contribution of a brigade and some aircraft and some warships. Then after that we entered in this long period of peacekeeping, or what our government fondly imagines to be peacekeeping, and imagines that somehow or other this was something special and a unique Canadian invention. And I'll talk a bit more about what peacekeeping really is later on. But the Canadian military was involved in some really violent action in peacekeeping in the Congo in the 1960s. And then of course 1974 with the Airborne Regiment was in actual combat, and there was that one day near Larnaca Airport where they were digging in with the expectation that a single Canadian battalion was going to have to fight for its survival against an entire corps of Turkish troops the next day. It didn't happen, but it was very close. There was a lot of shooting. In the 1990s, Canadian soldiers fired shots in anger in Bosnia and Croatia a number of times. It says a lot about the decline of the military in our own society that Ottawa did not ever really discuss what was going on in Bosnia and Croatia with the public. Troops who were having legs blown off by mines were being shot, by sniper bullets and everything else. When they came home, minus a leg or learning to live how to live with a punctured spleen, would find out that their injuries had never been reported here. Or if they were listed, when the single time the federal government carried a list, was that they'd suffered an accident with an automobile or had some other singular mishap. We had about 130 casualties there, and there were Canadian troops who were fighting, in conventional fighting, living under shell fire for days at a time, and fighting off company-style assaults, machine guns, grenades flying, everything else. And of course here, we knew nothing about it. Our Airborne Regiment on a peacekeeping mission in Somalia shot 4 people, largely to defend themselves or somebody else. There's a movie coming out right now about the Americans in Mogadishu, where the Americans got in a firefight where they lost 18 of their own troops and probably killed 500 Somalis under the worst possible circumstances. A desperate, dangerous situation. But our Canadian Airborne Regiment, all the aid groups in Somalia were going to Beledweyne, where the Canadians were, to see how things really worked well. And yet we somehow regard the Airborne Regiment as having disgraced itself and disgraced Canada, when it was probably one of the most proficient, professional, and well-behaved formations in the whole country. Canadian troops of Canadian airmen dropped bombs in the Gulf War in 1991, dropped bombs again on the Serbs over the Kosovo crisis in 1999. So we have a long history of participation in conflict in the 20th century, yet right now our military has never been as weak as it is now. It is in an absolutely appalling state. But here we are in a brand new century, a brand new conflict, and the one certain prediction that I can make is that in this new century we will be involved in more conflicts than we will need in our military. Now this is largely an aside from the things I actually wanted to talk about. But if I was to try and give you predictions really over what's going to happen in this particular crisis, I couldn't. I like to do a lot of camping, and actually one thing I've taken up in recent years is whitewater canoeing. And if you've ever done it, there's that little section where you're just at the head of the rapids. Up to a certain point, you're in charge of your canoe, and you can go left, right, backwards, or forwards, whatever. You can steer. But as you start to get into the head of the rapids, there's suddenly that one critical moment where the water bites and takes hold of your canoe. Now you've no choice. You're going down the rapids. That's it. What you can do is use your skill and your knowledge and your experience to try and make sure you don't tip over, miss a turn, run into rocks, or get swamped. But once that current bites in, you're going to have to take the river in front of you and you've no other choice. And right in the immediate couple of hours on September 11th, I was sitting in the CBC building when I wasn't in front of a camera or a microphone. I was over checking all the news wires that were coming in. But that was the sense, that we really had lost control of what the future was going to be, and we couldn't see how this crisis was going to end. Right now, at this moment, the Taliban has been badly broken. Their troop formations are being shattered. They're out of heavy equipment. The Al-Qaeda network is in serious trouble, and it's probably a fairly safe bet that within a couple of weeks, Osama bin Laden will die. This does not mean the end of this particular crisis. This people, the school of thought that generated the Islamic fundamentalists, cannot be attacked by the United States or by any other country. No matter what happens to the Taliban or Al-Qaeda, the security situation presented to us on September 11th is going to continue to be with us probably for years. Now, getting back to my white water metaphor, of course, if you're smart, you've actually got out before you entered the rapids, had a look so you see how many bends, twists, and whether or not there's a waterfall at the end of it all. But in this case, no. I mean, we don't know what's ahead of us. We don't know what twists and turns are coming. But I don't think we're ever going to really feel as safe as we felt in the 1990s. Now, I said I was going to talk a little bit about peacekeeping, and this is actually one of our problems, is that peacekeeping is actually one of the oldest military activities there is. Peacekeeping is as old as civilization. Soldiers do either of three things. They either get ready to fight another nation state, or they stay in garrison, or historically they're out on the frontier somewhere. And if you look at ancient Egypt, the Chinese and the Han Dynasty, Rome during the height of the Legion, or say British troops in places like, Afghanistan in the 19th century, what they were doing was peacekeeping, and things were pretty simple. Civilization is fundamentally about stability, stable lives, predictability. We know what's coming for us. We know that with a reasonable measure of confidence we can anticipate what's going to happen in our lives. Unstable areas, sometimes what we might call barbarian areas, although I wouldn't call people who live in them barbarians, sometimes threaten the stable areas. And normally the choice, as it was for Egypt, for China, for Rome, for Victorian England, and for us today, is that we have to get engaged in the unstable areas. We do trade. We try and negotiate with people. We try and maybe arm one group against another if we can't stop problems. But if an unstable area continues to generate trouble, what it does is it generates things like refugees. It goes back to the Bible. Why did Joseph go into Egypt? He was a refugee, and his family came right after him. Because they came from an area where basically food was out and it was politically unstable. Also, of course, unstable areas generate raiders, people who constantly cause trouble for stable areas. And if trade won't work, diplomacy won't work, the captain of the chariots saddles up, Han Chinese crossbowmen march off into the steppes, the legions sharpen up their short swords, or Tommy Atkins puts a round in his Martini Henry and goes up to the hills, and they go peacekeeping. They use force to restore order to unstable areas. When the history of the 21st century is written, it will probably start with the failure of the Western countries in the 1990s, and we had two sets of failures. The first failure was that we could see unstable areas forming, and there are some very unstable areas in the world today. You look at Robert Kaplan and the Coming Anarchy, descriptions, say, of West Africa, or parts of the Middle East. We looked at actually I think the classic case is Rwanda, where the Canadian general could see what was going to happen. He knew what was going to happen, and he was pleading for support. All he really needed was maybe a half company of troops, more ammunition, and the backing of the UN to decisively interfere before the situation got out of hand. He didn't get it. 800,000 people were killed, and the fallout from that conflict kicked off another conflict, which is still going on, has probably killed 4 million people. And that's the conflict in the Congo. But we didn't act, and that's what happened. Afghanistan was an unstable area, but it was nobody's business. We didn't care, and it became a sanctuary area that violent extremists who hate the Western world, and don't for a minute think this conflict is anything to do with Israel or the United States and the Middle East or anything. Islamic fundamentalists hate you. They hate you because you're more prosperous than they are, because you're more technologically advanced than they are, because you women get involved in public life and you actually have some control over what you like to do. They're jealous, they're inadequate, and they know it. Anyway, that's the other problem we have. We didn't get decisively involved when we should have, and now we're paying the price. The other problem we have is that we are open societies, and we want to keep this as an open society. But we've made some very fundamental mistakes over control in our society. Especially in Canada, we have embraced, I like cosmopolitan society. I really love, I hate using the diversity word, but it's true, I love it. But we've asked people to be something else other than being Canadians. And we've assumed that all cultures are equal at face value. And that's been a mistake, because they aren't. Other cultures have problems, they are unstable, and they brought them here. And we haven't had people, we haven't told them, when you come here, you're going to be Canadian. Then whatever else you want to be, but you're going to be Canadian first. And we've made a mistake. We've lost control over our frontiers and our borders. Our new security legislation that's proposed, I don't understand most of it, 700 pages of text. All I knew is that I had 2 simple tests for what was necessary for Canadian security. And this is where I'm going to finish off. The Ahmed Rassam test and the World Trade Center test. And I'm talking about the World Trade Center in Colombo. There was a World Trade Center in Colombo in Sri Lanka. In October 1997, about 3 weeks after it opened up, a Tamil tiger drove a truck bomb through the front window of it and detonated it. It was a small, very humble truck bomb, but it had about 400 kilos of RDX, a military-grade plastic explosive in the back, and it demolished the building. The explosives were bought in Ukraine with money raised in Canada. That same money and the same Ukrainian explosive shipment was used in dozens of other attacks. Not all of that explosive has still been used up, but these attacks have killed hundreds of people. And Sri Lanka never did anything to Canada to deserve this from us. And our test should be, we have to preserve the stability of other countries. Sri Lanka deserves stability, and it deserves stability from us. But instead we allow a group that up until September 11th I thought was the most dangerous group in the world to openly operate here. The other test, the Ahmed Rassam test, is quite simple. It's February 1994. Canadian immigration officers spot a traveler coming in from Paris, from France, and he's got a doctored French passport. These guys are sometimes good at their jobs. They could spot a false passport, so they took him aside and interviewed him. He confessed that yes, it was a false name, and he gave them his real name, Ahmed Rassam. He admitted that he'd been involved in an insurgency in Algeria, and the Algerian authorities wouldn't like him, but of course he was coming from France. But he made a refugee claim anyway, and they had to let him in. But right off the bat, you had 3 warning flags. He was already a guerrilla. He had access to false documentation, and he was traveling under a false name. His refugee claim wasn't a very good one, and he knew he was going to fail. So he abandoned his claim, and we never pursued him. That was the 4th flag. Here was somebody inside our country, operating on the loose, dropped his refugee claim, abandoned it, and nobody went after him. Then, of course, there's the next problem. The Montreal police soon become aware of Ahmed Rassam as part of an automobile theft ring. Not someone who's stealing cars for his own ticket, but part of a larger ring involved in a systemic criminal activity, an organized crime, which is the 5th warning flag. But of course, in Canada, nobody talks to anybody else. The Montreal police didn't know what Canada immigration knew about him. Immigration didn't know what the Montreal police knew about him. And because nobody's pursuing him, he goes off, develops a false set of identification, gets a passport under this false ID, leaves Canada, goes to Afghanistan, learns how to make very sophisticated explosives, comes back. At this time, we are being nagged by the French that he's here in the country and is someone we should be looking out for. And eventually, CSIS and the RCMP start on the trail. Except they don't have much money. The CSIS stakeout consists of driving by his house and looking to see if the lights are on. Well, actually, it's not really their fault that much. They just don't have much money. They don't have much in the way of ability. But the RCMP eventually gets on the trail, especially after the French have finally nagged us into raiding his apartment, where they find snippets of gear that might be used for bombs, traces of explosives, false IDs, and a black market handgun. And then they were fearlessly on the pursuit, but they were always about a week late behind him wherever he is, sometimes even later. And eventually Ahmed Rassam gets caught. Traveling into the United States, he's caught by an American customs officer with a trunk full of plastic explosive and some very sophisticated bomb timers. Now those are the two tests, the Colombo Center test and Ahmed Rassam. I don't think much of what Ottawa's proposing right now, and I just have those two tests to apply. Would they pass laws that would prevent Ahmed Rassam from entering the country and staying here? And would they pass laws that would prevent people in Sri Lanka from being killed by money raised here in Canada? And I think those are the only criteria we really need to look at. Everything else is superfluous. I've used up 21 minutes out of my allotted 20, so I will step down. Thank you again for the opportunity to address you.
Now we can have a few minutes just to take some questions for either of our guests. If anyone has a question that they'd like to have directed at a particular guest, and we'll take them from there. There's someone already.
I have a question for Mr. Thompson. Of course, there will be legitimate requests for help for Afghanistan, being the primary country that we know of right now. How do we know that this is legitimate? Are you going to send money there, or is it going to be funneled into something illegal against us? What's the criteria?
For getting involved in Afghanistan?
No, not sending help. No, they're asking for sending help from ordinary citizens.
Well, if you're asking me what groups, if you know, say if someone's passing the cup out saying, please help in Afghanistan, I would say that I really think a lot of some of the international aid groups. I think a lot of Médecins Sans Frontières. When you give them money, good things are done with it. The Red Cross, same International Red Cross, again, they work with what they're given, and the aid goes directly to people. The UN aid groups are kind of hit and miss sometimes, but actually over the 1990s they've been slowly improving and becoming more effective in the aid they offer. But stick with a group that you know about, and I couldn't say enough about Médecins Sans Frontières. I mean, they're really brave, good people working there.
Okay, thank you.
Any others? Hey.
Question for Professor Hilborn. The primary criticism against Star Wars missile defense is that it really doesn't address the easiest way to get a missile into the United States, which is just to take it by boat into one of the harbors or walk across the border with a suitcase. Would you comment on that?
Well, those are two different problems. As I said, one of the arguments against missile defense is that the bad guys simply resort to terrorism, which is what you're referring to, bringing the suitcase bomb into the country and setting it off and destroying a suitcase nuclear bomb. But the defenses against a suitcase nuclear bomb or people coming in on a ship with a nuclear bomb are one kind of defense, and defense against missiles is a different kind of defense against a different threat. There's no point in stopping the suitcase bomb if people can lob in a missile. There's no point in stopping the missile if people can use the suitcase bomb. So you have to stop both. But the fact you have to stop both does not mean you should stop neither. And some of the arguments seem to be, there's no point in having a defense. If we stop the missile, they'll get us with the suitcase bomb, but then if you stop the suitcase bomb, they might get us with a missile. So you need defense against both. That is, you need tight border controls, or North American perimeter controls. You need to have Coast Guard supervision of ships, checking out the ships before they come into harbor, which is being done now, I believe, in the United States. Check out the ships before they dock or come into the harbor. And then you have to have the missile defense as an entirely separate problem, a separate defense against a separate threat.
And of course, seventh and last, an ICBM would travel from China to New York in half an hour. A suitcase bomb, say, steamer trunk bomb. Getting a suitcase-sized nuclear weapon is really, really difficult. And the smallest nuclear weapons ever produced are about 50 pounds. But they're still quite large. That's what, 2-3 weeks shipping time? There's a difference.
You cannot control a diplomatic crisis with suitcase bombs, I think. If you want to be able to say to the United States, stop bombing our ships in Taiwan Strait, or we take out a city, you cannot say that we'll send a ship and try to take out your city with a bomb in a ship a few weeks from now. You want to be able to say that city goes 30 minutes from now.
We'll send a suitcase by FedEx to promise to get to
Boy. Laurie, we'll start this side.
I'd like to hear both gentlemen comment on the idea of a common perimeter. Does it really entail loss of sovereignty?
You want to take a crack at that first?
Well, it doesn't entail loss of sovereignty. We'd be quite perfectly free to have tougher regulations than the Americans. They'd have to be as tough as the American regulations, but I don't see there'd be any objection on the part of the Americans if our regulations were tougher for letting people into the country.
On the sovereignty issue, back in 1940, we already waived a large part of our sovereignty with the Ogdensburg Agreement when we already agreed to joint continental defense against threats from other states with the United States. So in a world now where we're dealing with threats from non-state actors, why not just go to the natural extension and cooperate on the defenses against non-state actors as well?
Can I add to that, Bob?
You want to
If we did have a common perimeter, would we then have access across the border without all the problems that are there now?
I think given that, 32% of our GNP comes from trade with the United States, it's in our interest to make sure that the border with the United States is as open as possible. And if that means having a joint perimeter with the supposed loss of sovereignty, so be it. And I think any sensible person would agree to that.
But can we delay another year or 2 or 3 or 5?
No, we're in a crisis now.
Mary Lou.
For libertarians and objectivists, neither of which is necessarily the other, the whole question of the initiation of force is always a big issue. So one of the things I heard you say really is that in order to keep peace and therefore keep stability and therefore prevent being attacked, we have to be involved in the initiation of force prior to anybody ever attacking us on our soil. That's the first thing that I just wanted to see what your comment on was. And the other is that when we are attacked, and when I say we, I'm a North American, as far as I'm concerned, when they attacked the New York Trade Center, the World Trade Center, they were attacking us as much as the United States. The United States is the symbol of prosperity and freedom, but we in fact enjoy a lot of the freedoms they have. So in that context, we're acting in self-defense in what is happening militarily now, but how far should that military action be carried before we say that we are now protected again and that we've defended ourselves against the criminals?
Actually, I guess...
Grab the mic there.
Sure. To your second remark, going back to my rapids things, I don't know how far and how long this crisis is going to last and what directions it's going to take us in. We might be in a 20-year conflict. Sam Huntington's book, The Clash of Civilizations, I thought was a pretty reliable guide to what was happening in the 1990s. And if he's right, we might be in a end up in a hammerlock contest with the entire Muslim world.
How will we know when it's over?
I don't know if it'll end.
We'll know if it's over, I suppose, if we've gone a few years with no attempt to blow anything up or do anything else that's damaging. In all likelihood, then it'll fade away. There won't be a definite date when we can say it's over. It won't end with a treaty being signed on the 5th of March 2015 or something. It will be thought of as over when no attempt has been made against us for several years.
Okay. Well, 3 more questions. We'll go to Paul at the back there.
This is a question for Mr. Thompson. If a tall gentleman, maybe 6'7", dressed in biblical robes, whose last known residence was a cave, was to show up at Pearson International Airport and say 4 words, "I'm a refugee," have the changes made in the legislation under Bill C-36 done anything to prevent us from having to accept him and turn him loose into the general population, give him welfare, legal aid, Medicare, and the whole 9 yards?
Remember that those changes haven't actually been implemented yet. So actually, I'd like to imagine that Eleanor Kaplan might reach a ministerial decision that this is someone who has to be detained, but sometimes I'm not so sure.
And apparently he could not be extradited up to the United States unless the Americans agreed not to give him a lethal injection.
All we have to do is just delete 1 word from the statement. Not.
Okay, David over there.
I guess I got a little bit of something to both of perhaps Dr. Hilborn first. They shelved the neutron bomb a few years back. As far as I
Jimmy Carter canceled the neutron bomb.
Yeah. Now, is there any possibility of that sort of being resurrected as an attack?
Well, the point of the neutron bomb, as I understand it, was essentially meant to be an anti-tank weapon. The Soviet armor was threatening Western Europe, and one way to stop Soviet armor was with the neutron bomb. The Soviet armor is not a problem anymore, and the Taliban doesn't have tanks in any number that are any good, and not many of them left, I guess, now, those they did have. So, I mean, why have a neutron bomb? What's the strategic need for a neutron bomb at the moment? Perhaps John Thompson can say if there's a strategic need for one. I can't think of one.
Well, the only thing is, like you mentioned, if we were to use nukes or anything, it's messy the way they sort of have them organized with all the destruction and the fallout, whereas tactical neutron bombs have a lot less radiation that dissipates very quickly and can be used on smaller towns or even smaller areas to neutralize forces or people we just don't particularly like.
Well, I was speaking of the theory that the Americans would retaliate against a nuclear strike by destroying the country that launched it.
Well,
and if you're going to deter a nuclear strike by making that threat credibly, you'd be threatening to use weapons, to destroy cities. You wouldn't be wanting to just take out a few blocks. You'd want to destroy the city.
Well, the thing I'm thinking of is that we've gone through almost 30 years of being politically correct and have gotten stupid in the head, and that's the reason why we had September 11th, as far as I'm concerned. We should maybe perhaps look at our ancestors who sort of relied more on their instincts and did what they had to survive. And like you say, we cannot imagine what might come in the next 50 years or even 100 years. But if we have to come to that point where it's a matter of survival of them or us, I don't exactly want to be the one that's politically correct and volunteer to be the one to go.
Well, just one thing to consider about nuclear policy is that the United States has spent a lot of time, actually all the NATO countries, in developing destructive capabilities that fall far short of the use of nuclear weapons. And if you look at the 1999 Kosovo bombings, the damage they did to the Serbian infrastructure, never before in human history was so much economic damage done so quickly for such little use of high explosive that now our conventional weapons are very, very deadly and dangerous, and they don't have to kill large numbers of people. Often we don't need nukes. And if you look at this weapon that's been described in the media as the daisy cutter, Daisy cutter is actually, it's called a sloop fay round. It's a fuel air explosive, has a radius of about 400 meters. Inside that 400 meters, you have the same blast over pressures that you get with some nuclear weapons. Often we don't need nuclear weapons at all unless you really want to annihilate a city with everybody in it. In that case, an ordinary H-bomb will do just fine.
Well, that's the only thing I was thinking about is that, like you say, science fiction scenario.
Okay.
Let's say somebody took out a couple of American cities and then the Americans suffered 10 or 20 million casualties. I don't think people are going to sit around and be so forgiving of Islam at that point in time, and I think the American government will have to make a definite response to that type of casualty.
Yeah, but the problem, you see, the problem I was explaining is that if the other side has concealed ICBMs, you don't know where they are. You cannot take them out before they're launched. If you have no anti-missile defense and you lose a city during a crisis, the other side trying to make a point about Americans, you stop bombing us with conventional weapons, for example. You stop bombing us with conventional weapons or you lose your cities. So they take out one to make their point and say, all right, here are our demands. And if you don't meet them, another city in 6 hours, another 6 hours after that, and 6 hours after that. New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Seattle, Houston, etc., Dallas, etc., etc. What American president is going to sustain his conventional, or for that matter, nuclear bombing of that country if he's going to lose a city every 6 hours and cannot stop it because he has no anti-missile defense and no means of finding the missiles, as we couldn't find those Iraqi Scuds in 1991.
Well, he's absolutely.
Okay, David, we're going to have to...
I just wanted to make one quick comment about what Patton said to his troops, and I guess it's at the beginning of the movie where he says, I don't expect you to go out and die for your country. I expect you to make some other poor dumb son of a bitch die for
Okay, last question for the public part, and that will be Wayne.
Yeah, I want to say something too. This is to both of you. Which country would you think would be the next target for the United States? Given my prediction is given both Iraq and Iran, Iran is allocated money towards in their budget towards terrorism. Would you say Iran will be the next target or Iraq?
The United States so far has behaved very carefully in this crisis. It's been tiptoeing in very cautiously and aware of the fact that if they go, I think they're aware of the fact that if they go after another Muslim country right now, they just might actually start the Third World War. There are other targets to go after. Sri Lanka, FARC in Colombia. Or they just might content themselves with the destruction of the Al-Qaeda network, sit back and see what develops after that.
Yeah, certainly in Washington there has been a good deal of discussion on whether to go after Iraq in the near future, once Afghanistan is cleaned up. Iran has not been discussed so much in that context, but there is an element in the administration that does want to go after Iraq and clean up what the first President Bush left unfinished when he failed to send the troops and tanks to Baghdad in '91.
Okay. We're running out of time. We have to close it off for the evening. If you have any other questions, we're going to be milling around for a while and certainly speaking one-on-one. On behalf of all of us here, I'd like to thank our guests once again, John Thompson and Kenneth Hilborn. The rest of you for showing up, and hope you had a good time, and that's the end of the formal part for the evening. So hope you had a good time, and we'll see you at our next event. Thanks very much for